Hey everybody, and welcome to a new segment we're doing here on Tommy Oliver TV. This is the Thursday Q&A. So, as you've probably noticed for the last couple weeks on this channel, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I've been uploading vlogs, talking about whatever really comes to mind. What I want to start doing now is on Thursdays, I want to kind of take some of my favorite, most interesting comments that I've noticed in all of those videos and address some of them and do a little bit of a Q&A from people who've made interesting points or added to the videos themselves. So we have a little bit of a dialogue going back and forth. Let's get started with Monday when we talked about Activision trying to monetize matchmaking. So one of the first comments I got was from a guy named Nathan C. And he says, Tommy, while I agree with how corporatizing games decreases their value, that does by no means make you a suitable judge of the game's design. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but you do irritate me on a few of the things you've said. Your point on the overblown design is completely null and void. People do want these games all the time. The sales speak for themselves. While yes, there are consumers who like games such as Cuphead and Undertale, and the designers of those games deserve praise for what they've made, it's completely idiotic to ignore the appeal of games like Star Wars Battlefront. I think one of the points that I was trying to make with the Cuphead comparison to mainstream games wasn't so much that like people should like Cuphead more than something like Star Wars or Battlefront, and I don't think that those games don't have their place. The point that I was trying to make in making that comparison, and I guess maybe perhaps I didn't make it very well, was that those games are successful despite a small budget. The whole cycle of increased hardware, more power, pushing better visuals, that's not a narrative that gamers said that the companies had to do. That's a marketing tactic that these companies designed. E3, right? How do they advertise new games? They don't show gameplay. They don't talk about game features. When you get a teaser for a game, it's a pre-rendered, heavily doctored, graphically upgraded version of what the final product's going to be. The selling point in these games are the visuals. So in order to deliver a compelling product in the market that these companies have designed, they are pushing the visuals. And the visuals, the design, is what is making these games so massively over budget, in addition to their huge marketing campaign that they're adding to that budget because they know that the game's going to cost a lot and they need to sell millions and millions of copies to make their investment back. And this is why we get things like microtransactions, because the $60 ticket sale of the game itself isn't enough to make back their money anymore. So we need to have $40 season passes, we need to cut up content to sell it individually to make up the extra money, and we need microtransactions and loot boxes in order for them to cover their bases. But they need to cover their bases on a bunch of bloat that they designed. It was the company's decision to say, we're going to push visuals. We're going to have this hardware cycle. Every couple years, you have to upgrade your hardware so we can push better visuals. Visuals are going to be our main thing. How much discussion in the gaming industry is about comparing frame rates, comparing texture details, comparing system performance and resolutions? This is what the gaming companies have set as the metric for talking about modern games. Visuals are a huge deal. Graphics are a big deal because that's how they market them to us. Ever since, the PS3 era with that Killzone 2 trailer, like that's what sold Killzone 2. That's what they were trying to sell it on. They didn't show any gameplay. It wasn't a gameplay trailer because there wasn't like a HUD or anything. Like obviously it was a pre-rendered thing, but that just proves my point even more. Visuals are how they're trying to sell these games. And visuals is where tons of this budget and these big, huge multi-million-dollar projects end up becoming a big problem. And what I'm saying with Cuphead and Undertale and things like that, I'm not trying to say that that's what games should be. I'm saying you don't need to sell people on visuals. I think gameplay and just unique ideas are enough to get people interested in games. So I don't feel too bad for companies who are like, oh God, guys, we have this huge budget. How are we going to pay it back? That's why we have microtransactions. I don't care. That's a grave that you dug. None of us were asking for that in the beginning. That's a marketing tactic that we're all invested in now because you started it. It was your idea. You were the guys who said, let's sell graphics. Not realizing that, hey, maybe this consistent push of technology increasing over and over again is going to make us fucked over in the long run because graphics, as they get more realistic, are going to cost more money and more time to actually make better and better and better. So it's their grave, now they're lying in it, and now they're nickel-diming us to pay for their short-sightedness. And that's where my problem really stems from. Joey Carthew says, there's literally nothing wrong with loot boxes, it's cosmetic only. If you cry about them, you're a bitch. And then on the other hand, Spider says, I hate even cosmetic loot boxes because I still remember when these things were free. So to respond to Joey first, I don't really have a huge problem with loot boxes in Overwatch. Overwatch's loot boxes are mostly cosmetic, and while I can definitely understand the point of someone like Jim Sterling who makes the argument that the haves and the have-nots gives that kind of back of your mind pressure of like wanting things that other people have, I don't have a ginormous problem with that. That's why when I cited loot boxes as being bad in this video, I used Mass Effect 3. Not only because I played Mass Effect 3's multiplayer way more than I've played Overwatch, but I think it's a much more egregious example of loot boxes, of having not just skins and cosmetic things, but actual weapons, actual classes, and like the bulk of the multiplayer experience locked away behind a paywall. And we're seeing this way more in games now. Like Overwatch, ironically being the one that started the whole loot box craze really in the mainstream at this point, we see games now that like Shadow of War is doing the same thing as Mass Effect strategy, which makes sense because they're both from EA. There was actually an interesting article that came out a couple days ago, and I was going to make a video on it, but it's today is when I saw it, there was a guy who worked with BioWare and EA on Mass Effect 3 talking about like the reason they push those loot boxes because EA just wants to make more money. They don't care about single player games anymore. And he cited that they're big whales. That's what they call these people who buy a bunch of loot boxes. The actual business term is you're a whale. Some of the biggest whales were paying up to $15,000 on loot boxes in Mass Effect 3. It's insane. And I mean, it's your money, do what you want with it, but $15,000 for a game, and like it preys on that kind of like slot machine addictiveness mentality. I don't really find that to be good. But my problem, Joey, with loot boxes, even in Overwatch, is the event loot boxes, because you give them a bunch of cosmetic items, skins and stuff, but then the skins are exclusive. You have X amount of months to get these skins. So if you really want to get one of these skins, it's not like you can just play the game and earn them. You have a certain amount of time and then they're gone. I really wanted the Halloween Mercy skin, the witch one. I thought that was really fucking cool. And I don't even play Mercy that much. Just aesthetically, I really liked it. It was never going to affect me in game, but the desire to spend more money to get it was heightened dramatically because I knew I only had a certain tiny window in order to get that. It's not like I could purchase it later. And I don't know if they've rectified that, because I know back during the Halloween event last year, there was kind of a backlash against Blizzard for having these timed exclusive loot box things. So I think it only makes sense. If you're going to have an in-game purchase timed, you should be able to just straight up buy it. I think that just makes sense, because you do have people who like to have everything in the game. And that goes back to what Spider was saying. Cosmetic items used to all be free in the game that you could either earn through accomplishments in the game or just unlockables as the game went on. These used to be included, and they've been pulled out and held for ransom behind loot boxes. And that's really the problem that I think is there. Anarchy says, just a quick note, Cuphead may not have the whoa, it's real looking type of visuals going on for it. That type of animation though is hard as fuck to do, and they made a goddamn game out of that style, so maybe don't compare it to Undertale, that's just walking pixels. Cuphead is much more than that. The reason I compared Cuphead and Undertale were just like they're two of the biggest indie darlings of the last couple years. I'm not saying that they were both the same amount of work in the visual department, just that neither of them had a AAA budget or were worked on by a AAA studio. Cuphead was started by just two dudes who wanted to make a game, and Undertale was Toby Fox's darling, and he worked with a couple people to do some of the art assets for it. So neither of these had an EA or an Ubisoft or an Activision budget behind it. And that's kind of why I lumped them in together. They're clearly two aesthetically very different things with very different goals. The Rational Pi said, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like games have never been cheaper. Even if you ignore platforms like Steam, the Humble Store, Google Play, and the App Store, where games are only $10 are considered expensive, and only look at $60 full retail cost games, because of inflation, those games are way less expensive than they were about 20 years ago. There's been about 50% inflation since the N64 came out, and we're still paying the same amount for games. If prices had kept up, those new releases would be going for $100 instead. So I guess that kind of goes back to what I just said about Mass Effect 3 and how to get everything with loot boxes, people are paying up to $15,000, which I think is way more than $60,000. But to talk about the retail cost of games, the N64, probably not the best example to cite, because the N64, because they were cartridges, they were way more expensive than other games at the time. N64 games were routinely $50 to $65 depending on what you got, whereas I think PlayStation around the time was between $40 and $50, and even through PlayStation 2, the original Xbox and GameCube, games were $50. If you remember, they weren't always $60. Back in high school when I was playing, Halo 2 and stuff, games were $50. And then they started introducing the special edition games for $60. You could get the Halo 2 special edition in the metal tin box thing. That was $60. And a bunch of games started doing that. And then all of a sudden, once they tested the water to see if you'd pay $60 for games were just $60 flat out next gen. So games have gone up a little bit in price. Maybe not in lockstep with inflation, but that's kind of where all this money comes in with the microtransactions, with cutting out the content. I would argue you that while the $60 full retail cost, I wouldn't even say it's a full retail cost. That's like the starting cost, right? Because if you want to buy a game for $60 right now, the big AAA budget games, right? It's $60, but you're not getting the full game. If I bought a $60 game, if I got something like Perfect Dark Zero when it first came out for the Xbox 360, or just most of the games through the Xbox 360 and PS3's lifespan, and even if you want to go back a generation before, even more certainly, anything for PS2, Xbox, the original, or GameCube, $50 to $60 got you the entire fucking game. Start to finish, everything was in there. Nowadays, you pay $60 at retail for the game, correct. But then there's a season pass, which, again, none of that content you get unless you get the season pass or buy the DLC individually for even more money. So that's content that normally would be given in the game. And if you want the full retail experience, that's part of the price now, is buying that content. If you want to get all the content out of multiplayer, now we're more and more seeing it locked behind loot boxes. So if you want the entire multiplayer experience, like imagine how much money it would cost to get something like the original Perfect Dark now. Do you remember all the shit that was packed in Perfect Dark? All the guns, all the weaponry, all the different sim modes you could have to play with AIs, the different game types, like all of that would be unlockable. It'd be like $1,000 worth of unlockables just to get the full span of what Perfect Dark for the N64 gave you today. The retail cost absolutely has stayed relatively static, even though it has increased a little bit over time, not in lockstep with inflation. But to compensate for that, right, because if the sticker price gets too high, you're going to start pulling back. Because we have this weird thing where you have the price of a console versus the price of what you're buying for it. So like if a game was $100 and the console you're buying it for is $200, it's just like, this is a little fucking ridiculous, right? I buy 2 games and I've bought another console. So you have to like play against that headspace. We have the cost of software is going up, but the cost of hardware is going down. So eventually, if we get to a point where the hardware is almost the same cost as the software for the hardware itself, people are gonna be like, well, what the fuck? This doesn't make any sense. You know, you have these decades of programming what media is worth. So this is how they're getting around that kind of mental head block, is by pulling things out of the game and selling them to you in addition after the fact, so it doesn't feel like such a big sticker shock. And so to me, and I think a lot of people would agree, the full cost of games is well over $100 now if you want everything that you normally would have gotten 10 years ago, you know, at the register. All right, so let's move on to Tuesday. That was pretty long-winded. This is going to be a long video. Holy shit. Tuesday, we talked about difficulty in games, and this was an interesting topic. I got a lot of different stuff about it. Alex Soto starts us off with, I think you're pathetic, but that's just my arbitrary, practically meaningless standards. I believe you should always be progressing, challenging yourself, and getting better. However, I also realize doing so in a video game does nothing. And, I mean, that's your perspective. You're allowed to think I'm pathetic when it comes to video games, but I agree with you. I think you should always be progressing, challenging yourself, and getting better. My perspective on that is that I only have a certain amount of time in my day and in my life to get better at certain things. And so I choose to pursue my artistic career, quote unquote, my artistic progression, whether it be in 3D modeling, illustration, making videos, or things like that. That's where I choose to focus that desire of progressing, challenging myself, and getting better. Video games to me aren't something that I self-identify with or something that I feel is core to what I want to do with my life. So in that regard, I don't feel like progressing, challenging myself, and getting better. Like when you play a game, you want to get better as you play it, but I'm not going to sit here and break my back 100%ing everything or becoming the very best at multiplayer in a game or something like that, because my personal perspective on where I want to excel doesn't really align with being a gamer. It aligns with being an artist. So if you are heavily invested in the identity of being a gamer and being good at video games is what you want to do with your life, then I totally understand with challenging yourself, getting better, and progressing in the field of video games. For me, that's art. And I think for other people, you know, it's playing an instrument, being a video editor, being an author. And I think everybody, no matter what your identity is or what you want to do with your life, you should be challenging yourself, progressing, and getting better. So I think that's absolutely the right way to look at life. I just think that everybody has different areas that they want to focus on, that is, because we can't all be good at everything. We just don't have enough time, which sucks. I would love to have more time to get good at all these other stuff. Like learning an instrument and playing music is an area I would love to find more time to get good at, because I think it would just complement all my other skills that I'm invested in really well. And every year that I put it off, it gets harder to learn new skills, which sucks. But you just got to prioritize, man. And for some people, that's games. For other people, that's art. For other people, it's like, I don't know, the stock market. Like, do you, man. Life's Eagle said, I'm really glad you posted this. I recently started playing Nier Automata and the opening segment was just owning me no matter how hard I tried. I believed I was good enough of a gamer to try the normal difficulty. Boy, was I wrong. All the comments of get good on forums when I looked up what I was doing didn't exactly help. Cocopelli responds, how exactly did playing on easy ruin your enjoyment exactly? And then Alex Soto comments, get good, filthy casual, which kind of proves his point. So this is something that I'm not really a huge fan of in the gaming community. I understand there are people who enjoy the challenge. There are people who want you to just get good, because that's what they do. They get good. But not everybody enjoys games like that. There's a difference between I appreciate the challenge and I want to push myself further like that, and then taking that desire and pushing it onto everybody else in the community around you. Not everybody plays those games for the right reason. I know I'm stepping dangerously close to game journalism category, but I'm not saying like every game needs to have an easy mode. Absolutely not. Something like Cuphead, if they designed it to be a challenging game, it should be a challenging game. That's what the creators wanted the game to be, and nobody has the right to change that. If you don't like the difficulty of Cuphead, well then you don't have to play it. But if a game does have an easy mode, like Nier Automata does, and you want to enjoy the game and the challenge gets too difficult, then you should be allowed to play it on that without any punishment. Like, it's part of the game. It's there because the developers decided that that was an acceptable way of experiencing their game. It's what they designed. And to answer Cocopelli, who asks, how did playing on easy ruin your enjoyment? It's because playing on easy, if you're part of the gaming community, now comes with this weird stigma. Because you know that if you're playing the game in a way that your peers would look down on you for. And so, while there's no inherent lack of enjoyment as long as you're enjoying the game, because we're social animals and there is this community around video games, you don't want to ostracize yourself from that community, even if nobody knows, because you're going to feel like you're ostracizing yourself by virtue of doing something that the community tends to look down on. And that's where my problem with shitting on people for being casual gamers really comes from, because at the end of the day, we're all enjoying the same art form, no matter how you choose to enjoy it. And that's why I wanted to make this video, to talk about, yeah, I play games not for the challenge, and I don't think that's a problem. I don't think other people who do that is a problem. The problem becomes if you're someone who likes playing easy games and doesn't like being challenged, and then say, well, I need the entire gaming sphere to cater to my desires. If you become a gaming journalist, essentially, that's where the problem comes from. But the problem on the other end of the spectrum is when you're doing the same thing. That's what I think is really funny, is we have all these game journalists who are shitting on Cuphead and all these other games, saying they're too hard and we deserve the full experience even if we haven't earned it, right? They're projecting their desires and their idea of what games should be onto everybody. But then you have all these people fighting them saying, no, this game is hard and it's supposed to be hard. But in any other conversation, if someone was trying to play a game that has the option to be on easy, a lot of these people would turn around and say, fuck you, get good, which is the exact same position as the game journalist, just on the other end of the spectrum. So my perspective is live and let live, let people play games, but don't try and change games, change what you're playing to suit your desires. And don't feel you're entitled to any experience, even if you've bought it, because you bought the product. Whether you enjoy the product or not is your problem, not the problem of the people who made it. You know, if you buy a movie and you don't like it, you don't say they should change the movie. If you buy a book and you don't like it, you don't say they should change the book. You bought the product, you got what you paid for. It's completely on you to whether you actually made an informed enough purchase decision that you would like it or not. The same thing goes with games. You're not owed an experience. You're owed a product and you've bought it and you've gotten it, unless they've cut it up and made it all fucking microtransactions. So let's move on into the big one, because this video is already almost a fucking half hour and it's probably going to double this length now. I'm going to have to try really hard to cut this down. Yesterday, on Wednesday, we talked about Wolfenstein, the New Colossus, and its questionable advertising campaign. And I just want to start this video by clarifying, because clearly I didn't clarify enough in the beginning, even though I thought I did. I personally do not have any issues with the advertising done in Wolfenstein, the New Colossus. I was explaining why other people might. So just keep that in mind as we go through here. We're going to start with Callum O'Reilly, who says this argument is deeply flawed. 1. Nobody who's upset about this game are killing Nazis. Seriously? This is an intentionally ignorant statement. A sizable number of people are angry about this because they are Nazis and or white supremacists. 2. You keep using the fallacy of keep your politics out of my games. Firstly, all media is inherently political because we are, as a people, are inherently political. Second, this game was always going to be politically charged in our modern environment. Third, and most importantly, this idea of escapism is the exact same argument these kinds of idiots make when they say football players shouldn't be allowed to kneel during the national anthem, or when we say celebrities shouldn't make political statements. Keep your politics out of my blank is such a bullshit argument. I have problems with basically everything you said here. To your first point about there being Nazis and or white supremacists who are mad about the game, you know what? I will give you that. My statement was overly general just to make a point. There are absolutely Nazis and white supremacists out there who had a problem with this game for attacking their personal identity, which I find is hilarious because their entire identity is about attacking another personal identity. And that's why I don't even consider their position. Nazis are dicks, they're assholes, I don't respect their opinion. I respect their right to state their opinions, but I also respect my right to point and laugh at them and think that their identity is completely and utterly fucking retarded, as I think everybody in this comment section would agree on. So I didn't even consider the actual Nazis' perspective because I don't consider the Nazis' perspective to be anything worth respecting in the first place. But there are a lot of people who aren't Nazis who are upset about this, and I was voicing that perspective not as my own, but just to explain in response to someone like Rich of Review Tech, which is where the idea for the video came from, that not everybody was mad because killing Nazis. A lot of people were mad because they were complaining, they were taking a side politically. And some people who wanted to play the game might not side with that political perspective. To talk to the second point, this is where the majority of my disagreement comes from, because I don't think there's really anything in here that I really buy. All media is inherently political, I think is kind of a bullshit statement. Not all media is political. You can read political intentions into all media, sure. That's your subjective interpretation, but I think there's tons of media that exists that is not to make a political statement, but just to entertain, to tell a good story. Now, when the story comes out and people read it, I'm sure they can infer politics into it, but that's your subjective interpretation, not the objective of the piece. So I will defend the fact that I don't think something like Indiana Jones, Hellsing, or the original Wolfenstein were trying to make objective political statements about Nazis. You can read that into it yourself. And I think it's especially easy to do that with a modern lens, now that Nazis have taken the forefront of the political stage again, which I think is a completely insane statement to even make in 2017, but here we fucking are. Escapism is absolutely a respectable thing to want. And again, but it goes back to kind of what I was saying before with video games, in that if you want to have your media be a form of escapism where I just want to relax, decompress, enjoy something, and not have it be politicized, that's on you. Right? Because that's your experience that you want. And I think there are pieces out there that are pure escapism, that don't have political undertones or don't have politics in them that you personally want to disconnect from. But the responsibility is on you to choose your media that chooses to ignore politics, right? If you're a football fan and football has become political because of the national anthem stuff, if as long as the NFL is fine with supporting that and having that on their platform, then you have to make a choice. You have to decide, do I want to keep watching football and have to deal with this thing that I'm personally uncomfortable with or don't like in this piece of media, or do I want to get my enjoyment from something else? That's up to you. That's the free market at work. You have the choice of where you want to spend your time and money on, and the companies and whatever media that's out there has the choice of putting whatever they want into there. That's the greatness of free speech and the power of the free market. And I'm not the biggest fan of capitalism, but I'm not going to lie, that's a huge benefit to the system that we live in, is that we can make choices like that. And it's the same thing with celebrities. If you find a celebrity making a statement that you don't like, well, that's their free speech. They're allowed to be as insightful or as insipid as they want to be. You can choose whether you want to support them, whether you want to turn the TV off when they're making the statement or block their tweets, or not support the films that they're a part of. Again, that's freedom at work. They're free to say what they want, and you're free to respond in any way that you want. You know, that extends to celebrities, that extends to media, and that extends to our political opponents, people like fucking psychotic white supremacist Nazis who say a bunch of bullshit that literally nobody but them finds to be worth the time anyways. That's kind of where I'm at with this, is just that everyone should be allowed to talk, and we should be able to ignore and just malign anyone who we think is retarded. Domino Pivot said, when I saw their ad campaign for Wolfenstein, I thought, oh my god, these awesome bastards, this, I love it. Sure, it's clearly mocking Trump's campaign and riding on the popular trope of comparing him with Hitler. It's really risque of them to make an ad that could offend Trump supporters, so it really makes me laugh to see them have the guts to do it. These are people with opinions, and video games are a piece of art. What's wrong with a game being opinionated? I only hope everyone involved with the game is okay with that. I can easily picture a programmer who voted for Trump that has nothing to do with the marketing campaign being super pissed. And this is pretty much where my opinion really lies. If you were gonna ask me, Tom, what's your actual opinion on this thing? It's pretty much that, minus like the glee in seeing it. I'm just nonplussed one way or the other. I don't really care. But that's the whole thing. Like, this was clearly a very effective marketing strategy, and that's why it was done at the end of the day, which is probably something I should have commented more on in the actual video, is that this is going to work very well, because there's obviously a huge contingent of people who are very anti-Trump, who are very anti-current government establishment, and by having a game that plays to that you're going to get a lot of press from people who like Trump, and you get a lot of support from people who hate him. So it's a win-win no matter what side of the fence you fall on in terms of getting attention towards your product. And that's the point of advertising. So it was a great move in terms of just making money and getting attention. They're making huge returns on their investment on running these ads, which is the best thing a company could ask for when they're supporting a product. Constituent 32 said, Wolfenstein isn't political, are you fucking brain dead? To which Daniel Gillifan responds, calling Wolfenstein political because you kill Nazis is like calling Doom religious because you kill demons. And this is actually a pretty interesting point that I hadn't considered when making the video. I do believe that Wolfenstein, the original, wasn't designed to have a political statement, even though it could be viewed with a political lens nowadays. But Doom is a great example too, because we had this huge backlash back in the early 90s with Doom from the religious right saying that it was satanic because of all that satanic imagery in it. And probably a lot of the same people who are saying that clearly Wolfenstein is political probably also a couple years ago, when this was still kind of a thing going on, maybe 10 years ago with Jack Thompson and all this shit, talking about violence in video games and religious symbolism in video games, would say, it's clearly a video game, calm the fuck down. So again, I can't speak for anybody in my comments or anybody just in general for holding both of these ideas at the same time, but it seems like you can't have it both ways. You can't say that one is inherently political and the other one isn't inherently religious for talking about certain things or having certain imagery in it. So yeah, I think that's a good point. Feel free to disagree with me, but I think on principle, you got to either agree with both or neither of those statements. Peteman12 says, but all media is political. I've always hated that statement because I find people prone to say those things are the types to say, and I know what those politics are. Just because you can interpret everything as political doesn't mean that everything is political, especially when the people who say that aren't using politics in that manner. And I pretty much talked about this earlier, but yeah, that's exactly my perspective on it. You can read politics into anything, but that doesn't mean it was inherently trying to make a political statement. And we're going to wrap this up with probably my favorite comment in the entire 300 plus comments I've gotten in the last 24 hours from Robert Solo. He says, I mean, you're right, but I don't care. Shut up, Tom. I can respect that. And so with that, it ends this very long first Q&A video. Thank you for watching if you stick through the whole thing. I'll be back next week with another wrap up at the end of the week with hopefully a bit less of hot topics, but still nonetheless interesting. So until next time, guys, I'm Tom Oliver. Take it easy. Have a good week. I will talk to you on Monday.